Today we're going to be taking a look at the Byzantine Empire. At least that's what historians have come to refer to the Eastern Roman Empire by that title. They themselves didn't actually call themselves Byzantine. The name comes from the old Greek colony of Byzantium, which becomes the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Constantinople from the time of Constantine on. This is the remainder of what was left of Rome. We talked about the fall of Rome in the west, at least in 476. The east, however, survives for a great while longer, and it's going to be a bulwark for Europe against some incursions from the east that we're going to get talking about. And it's going to be one of the dominant civilizations throughout the Middle Ages. This is really our first overview of the period that we're going to refer to as the medieval world. We don't tend to think of the Byzantine Empire or study the Byzantine Empire very much when we're thinking about the Middle Ages, because in Europe there is a very different situation than you have in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. But today we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at some of the highlights as we do a historical overview. So let's go ahead and pick up with really where we left off with ancient Rome. Now, the dates I have here for our historical overview are going to be 395 to 1453. Now, the reason I picked 395 and not 476 is that it was in 395 that you have the final division of the great empire of Rome. This is going to be the permanent split between east and west. Now, if we take a look at the map, you can see exactly where, or approximately where, depending on how accurate the map is, the two territories were divided. In the yellow, you've got the Western Roman Empire, and the purple, you've got the Eastern Roman Empire. Some of the major cities, we've studied a lot of the important cities of the ancient world going on. You still have important centers, particularly among the patriarchal seats, since we're going to be focusing on the growth of Christianity during the Middle Ages. I want you to remember that you have really important seats for the bishops, the major bishops known as the patriarchs, in places like Constantinople, which happens to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Also in Rome, which is no longer a capital. Even at the late stage of the Roman Empire, the Romans were really ruling from further up in the north, Ravenna. The capital actually moved around quite a bit during the later the later empire. But you also have seats at Alexandria, at Antioch, and then at Jerusalem. Those are the 5 patriarchates. So those are going to be religious centers. They're not all going to have a really important political role. Constantinople and Rome are going to be the most important too. Other cities just worth mentioning, like I said, Ravenna, which is the Byzantine administrative center in Italy for a good portion of the time that Byzantium controls Italy. It's also going to be the Ostrogothic capital situated in northern Italy, following the Roman model in the late Republic, like I said. And then up north a little bit further in Italy, you've got the city of Venice, which is going to show up right about here. Now, this city is going to emerge slowly throughout the Middle Ages and particularly into the Renaissance period as a very important economic power. It's going to become a republic that is going to dominate really Mediterranean sea trade, and is going to have a long-standing relationship with the Byzantine Empire, sometimes adversarial, sometimes as an ally. Now, Venice actually shows up for the first time historically, or gets its beginning in the late Empire, actually in the middle of the 5th century. Around 452, the Huns, under Attila, attack the nearby site of Aquileia, which you see on the map right next to Venice. It was during the destruction of Aquileia that you've got a flight of a lot of the people from that region into the islands and lagoons to seek refuge, and some of these are going to eventually grow into the state of Venice. Okay. Now, there's plenty of other centers that I could mention. Athens is still alive. It's going to continue to be a site of philosophical study for the beginning of the Eastern Roman Empire. We'll talk about what happens in Athens in a little bit, but we're going to now focus in on Constantinople particularly. Okay. Now, remember, this is the eastern portion of the empire, and its capital was at Constantinople since the time of Constantine. The empire, like I said, continues to call itself Roman all the way through to the end. Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, that name is going to be something historians use. The emperor in the east would continue to be called the Augustus. There is going to be a change a little bit in the terminology later. They're going to adopt the term basileus, which is the Greek word for king, kind of replacing the title of Augustus as you move linguistically from Latin to more of a Greek-speaking culture. Now, the size of the empire is going to fluctuate. Over the next 1,000 years, it's going to grow and shrink. Particularly near the end, it's going to continue to shrink until you really have only the city of Constantinople itself that remains. Now, at its peak, Constantinople was one of the largest cities in all of Europe. As a matter of fact, it was the largest city in Europe, and it was one of the most powerful cities and prosperous cities in the entire world of its day. At its peak, we could say that the population was somewhere around 800,000 people, maybe close to 1 million, though it's hard to really estimate. Which dwarfed, like I said, any other city in Europe. Even the city of Rome, which at its peak was larger than that. I mean, it had a population probably over 1 million at its heyday. Rome had dwindled by the time we get to the Middle Ages. It was a city of maybe 30,000 people, okay, which was radically shrunk down from its peak. Now, 330 is when Constantine made this city his capital. If you don't remember why he did this, it was because you've got this really strategically located city at the old Greek colony of Byzantium. It's on the Bosporus, basically at the crossroads of where you move from the Mediterranean Sea into the Black Sea. So as far as sea trade, it's a very strategic place. It's also a close point between Asia and Europe. So if you're traveling by or other routes, you can cross over there pretty easily. And it was also located very close to the main opponent of the Eastern Roman Empire, which happened to be the Sasanian Persian Empire. So it was a little bit closer to the defensive border that needed to be maintained. Remember, the fall of Rome was partly due to manpower issues and movement of troops from the west more to the east to deal with the Persians. Okay, so Constantinople, very strategic. Now, in 395, Theodosius, who was known as Theodosius the Great, dies. And when he dies, he leaves the empire to his two sons, Arcadius and Honorius. And it was the east that was given to his son Arcadius to rule. And that is going to be, like I said, the permanent division between east and west. Now, if we turn to the city and look at what happens, one of the reasons the Eastern Empire is going to last so long is really because of what they do with the capital city itself. In 413, the Emperor Theodosius II actually tears down the walls that had been constructed by Constantine in order to double the area, the size of the city within some new fortification walls that he builds. Okay, now the new fortification walls are going to be stretching all the way around the peninsula that is the city of Constantinople. It had water on three sides naturally. What Theodosius II does is he digs a moat on the fourth side, ultimately turning it into an island. And at the side where you have the mainland side, the broadest side, you have not only the moat, but beyond the moat, you have a series of two walls that stretched. A lower outer wall punctuated with towers, and behind that a taller wall with, again, higher towers running east to west. So you've got a double defensive structure plus the moat to cross if you're going to attack the city from that side. On the other end of the city, you've got the construction of a fortified center across the Golden Horn known as Galata. And then from the city of Constantinople to that fortress, you have a chain that was slung across the waterway to basically stop any kind of ships going down the side of the city to, again, give it a little bit of extra support. The city basically becomes a virtual fortress. And it's going to be nearly impossible to take this city, really until technology changes much later and as we get to the 15th century. This is one of the reasons this empire is going to last for the next 1,000 years. That is a very long stretch of time as far as any political entity goes, historically speaking. And it's really due to the fact that this city is so impregnable. As a matter of fact, near the end of that 1,000 years, this city will be essentially the only portion of the empire left. As a matter of fact, it's hard to call it an empire, though we still do that once you get to that situation. If we take a look at the greater Mediterranean, let's go back and talk about how the Roman Empire in the west falls. And as we move to the east, we should probably recap a few of the things. Like in 475, you have the emperor of the west, a guy by the name of Julius Nepos, who is deposed by his Magister Militum, a guy by the name of Orestes, who then replaces the emperor with his own son, who is still a boy, a guy by the name of Romulus Augustus, or Augustulus, the little Augustus. Nepos ends up continuing to reign in a very small portion of territory along the Dalmatian coast, at least for the next 5 years or so. So you do have him maintaining, in a way, an imperial presence right there next to the Eastern Empire. But the West itself, what was left of it at least, was under the command of this boy emperor. Now in 476, he is ousted. He's ousted by Odoacer, who was one of the barbarian chieftains who actually served for a while under the emperor. Odoacer, remember, doesn't make himself emperor, though. What he does is he makes himself king of Italy and actually wants recognition from both Nepos and the legitimate Eastern emperor Zeno of his control of Italy. Odoacer recognizes Zeno, for instance, as emperor and actually offers to be his imperial viceroy in Italy. And Odoacer, even though he, at least on the surface, presents himself as loyal to the empire, he ultimately foments rebellion against Zeno down the road. For that reason, Zeno eventually sends into Italy some troops under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, in order to overthrow Odoacer, and that begins in 488. The Ostrogoths move into Italy at the instigation of the Eastern emperor. Now, following the reign of Zeno, you've got the reign of an emperor by the name of Anastasius. Anastasius was a Monophysite. Just so you remember the religious situation within the empire, as you continue to move towards an official Christianity, what's going to emerge is going to be the form of Christianity that we attach to the Nicene Creed. So what comes to be known as Orthodox Christianity, but it wasn't the only Christianity in existence. During the time of Theodosius the Great, there was a push to make Christianity the official religion of the empire, and it did take steps to oppose paganism for the most part, but you still have other versions of Christianity circulating. One of them was the version known as Monophysitism. It was deemed a heresy by the Council of Chalcedon in 451, but it's still around. And even here, with Anastasius, you've got an emperor who is not Orthodox. Now, this is going to become a rarity because eventually the emperors in the East are going to be universally Orthodox and even defenders of the Orthodox version of Christianity, but that hadn't actually taken place just yet. You still have a bit of toleration for some of these other versions of Christianity, even at this date. Now, under Anastasius, you have a great amount of prosperity. The taxes were low. The empire was fairly stable. And it was at this time that in Italy, Odoacer ended up being defeated by Theodoric. And rather than returning the peninsula of Italy to the empire, as Zeno had hoped, Theodoric ends up taking the territory for himself. Now, Theodoric and the Ostrogoths are going to form their own kingdom now in Italy. And it's going to be short-lived, but just, again, to go with this theme of the religious differences, the Ostrogoths, as well as many of the other barbarian tribes, were Christianized by this point, but they were not Orthodox Christians. At least the majority of the barbarian tribes that had converted to Christianity, forms of Christianity that are Arian. Arianism, I don't want to get into the distinctions between these different groups, like Monophysitism, which I just mentioned. It was a particular heresy that dealt with the nature of Christ, and it held that there was only one nature. That's where the word mono comes from, monophysis, the idea of one nature, and that nature being divine. The Arians had a very different perspective. The Arian heresy was that that Jesus was a created being and not divine at all. So those are a couple of those variations. And like I said, the Arian nature of the Goths and groups like that is ultimately going to keep them from being really closely tied to the Eastern Empire, which, like I said, becomes more and more Orthodox. Under the rule of Theodoric in Italy, worth mentioning is what happens with the figure of Boethius, somebody that I've never mentioned before in this class, but somebody worth mentioning now that we're on the verge of the beginning of the Middle Ages. Boethius was a senator, he was a consul who served under Theodoric, and he was one of the great philosophers of his day. Ultimately, he is arrested by Theodoric under charges of conspiracy against the crown, put into prison, and while he's in prison, he actually writes a very important work known as the Consolation of Philosophy. And this becomes a really popular work in the Middle Ages. It's actually going to be one of the greatest and most popular works of philosophical works throughout Europe. Now, he ends up being executed by Theodoric, and the unfortunate part of this, I mean, obviously it's unfortunate when somebody's executed, but it's also unfortunate because Boethius was instrumental in translating into Latin a number of works from the philosopher Aristotle. Now, there weren't very many works that he actually had the opportunity to translate. Most of his works had to do with, that he translated had to do with things like logic. So when it comes to the Middle Ages, Europe ended up having a very small amount of Aristotle preserved in the language of the region. Most of Aristotle effectively was lost to Europe during the Middle Ages, with the exception of, a few works like I just mentioned. And that's one of the reasons when you think of philosophy as it develops throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, it's going to be more influenced by Platonism and Plato, Platonic thinking, than Aristotelian thinking. Aristotle would then later be reintroduced to Europe, but rather late, and it would be through the influence, really, of the Muslim thinkers in Spain. This is actually the way that Aristotle returns to Europe, is via Islamic influence in Spain, and that's going to have a big impact, especially when we get to the 13th century A.D., but that's getting ahead of the story just a little bit. The next emperor that I'm going to mention briefly is a guy by the name of Justin I. He reigned from 518 to 527. He was also a Goth. He was an Orthodox Christian Goth. He was a Roman Illyrian Goth. And he was a poor guy. He came from the lower peasant classes, worked his way up through the military, and eventually became emperor. He was actually one of the imperial guards, the excubitor for Anastasius. When he comes to power, I guess his biggest contribution is the fact that he adopts his nephew, makes sure his nephew is well educated and trained to succeed him. And this individual, his nephew, is going to be probably the most important figure in the early history of the Eastern Roman Empire, and this is a guy by the name of Justinian, often referred to as Justinian the Great, even referred to as the last true Roman emperor of the empire. That might be a little bit of an overstatement, but his reign was between 527 and 565. Again, like his uncle, he was a Romano-Illyrian Goth. He was a native speaker of Latin, but he was also, like I said, highly educated in law, which is going to be really important, theology, and history. Like I said, this is one of the great periods of the Byzantine Empire because it's going to see a very rapid re-expansion of the empire, which I'm going to get to in a second, but it doesn't start out quite as strong as it ends. The emperor himself marries. He came up, like I said, from the lower classes and also takes a lower class bride, the Empress Theodora. She comes from the theater for the most part. She was an actress. Actors in general had a fairly negative reputation in the Roman world. I think I may have mentioned that when we talked about Nero, who had a passion for acting, even though he wasn't very good at it. It was kind of beneath the emperor to engage in that kind of stuff. And it was definitely viewed as beneath the emperor to marry somebody from the lower classes like that. Apparently her father was a bear keeper, worked in the hippodrome, which is the chariot arena in the city of Constantinople. And she was also a Monophysite, which is interesting because Justinian is going to be one of the great promoters of Orthodox Christianity, yet he was married to a woman who had embraced what came to be known as a heresy, probably because of influence of her time in Alexandria. This is where Monophysitism was really, really popular at the time, was in North Africa, particularly around Egypt. Anyways, she's going to be really influential in his reign, at least up to the time of her death, because she is going to actually make him a much stronger emperor. She's going to have a lot to do with his rule. And one of the instances where she has a direct influence on him is when it came to the Nika Revolt. The Nika Revolt happened in 532. Now, to set the stage for this, there was war going on at the time with the Sasanian Persian Empire to the east, and Justinian was interested in kind of settling that up and trying to make a peace treaty and ending that war. It was a rather unpopular war. And back in the city, you've got all kinds of problems really over tax issues, some civil service reform that had gone on. There was actually an execution of a couple people that were arrested on the charges of rioting within the city. And this apparently was very unpopular and led to more rioting that breaks out. Now, the situation in the city was you have these political, or rather pseudo-political factions in Constantinople. Now, to draw a picture of how this was organized, it's I'm going to use an analogy, I guess, to maybe football fans. Today, when we think of different, NFL teams or even high school teams, it doesn't really matter. People kind of gather together and they wear their team's jersey and they support their team and they kind of oppose people that are fans of other teams. Maybe more like what you might see in European soccer, maybe than American football, because I know in European soccer matches, a lot of times the fans will actually erupt into brawls over the results of various games. Not so much here in the States, but this is kind of the way it was in Constantinople. It was not over football or soccer or anything like that. It happens to be around the chariot races. Like I said, the hippodrome, the chariot track, the circus there in Constantinople had a number of different popular teams that were organized or kind of grouped around color. So, for instance, there was the blue team and the green team and the red team and the white team. And a lot of fans kind of gathered together, and they were like the blues or the greens. And these ultimately spill over into politics. The people that were associated with the blue team tended to think alike and take particular stances on political issues and theological issues. And they would become rivals with groups like the greens. Well, it happens to be the blues and the greens. Kind of the, I guess it's like, politics in the United States being organized around NASCAR, but it's these groups that ultimately band together and attempt to overthrow Justinian in 532. And they attempt to install another emperor, the nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius, on the throne. And they're actually pushed into rebelling and rioting by other nobles who resented the fact that Justinian and his wife are kind of low-born, kind of below the office that they hold. They actually make an assault on the palace at the peak of the rioting, and they start to burn the city. And for about 5 days, Justinian is besieged in his own palace. And he was considering getting out of the city, fleeing and retreating. He didn't know how to handle it. And Theodora, his wife, is the one that basically convinces him to stay and put up a resistance, to put up a fight. She said he'd rather die as empress than become a nobody again. So he decides to stay. Ends up using his general Belisarius, who's one of the really important generals during this time, and some of his other administrators to negotiate with the rioters. He kind of gets all of the rioters together in the hippodrome itself. And what Belisarius ultimately does is he closes the doors on the circus and unleashes the imperial troops on the rioters right there. And the estimates are that he killed about 30,000 citizens in this attempt to squash the rebellion. Definitely was a turning point in the reign of Justinian, where he becomes a much stronger emperor. After this horrible slaughter, he ends up going on to try to reconquer the previous Roman Empire. This begins in 533, 534, starting with North Africa. Belisarius is sent to the North African area to deal with the Vandal kingdom. If you remember, the Vandals had conquered North Africa. This was going on during the time of Augustine, who we talked about. As a matter of fact, the city of Hippo was under siege at the time of Augustine's death by the Vandals. They ultimately had taken over North Africa, set up a kingdom there, and Belisarius is going to launch an attack from Sicily, which was directly north of Carthage, at a base basically provided to him by the Ostrogothic queen of Italy, a queen by the name of Amalasuntha. This is the daughter of Theodoric. Within a short amount of time, North Africa comes back into the imperial territories. All right, it's reconquered fairly quickly, and that coin that you see on the screen is actually commemorating the conquest or reconquest of North Africa. Of course, the war didn't stop there. Justinian had his eyes set on the rest of the old Western Empire. In 534, Amalasuntha, who was regent in Italy, was actually killed by a usurper, Theodahad. Her son had passed away, and this becomes the pretext for Justinian's campaigns into Italy. Okay, in 535, Justinian uses revenge for her death as an excuse to invade Italy, and Belisarius is sent in and reconquers Ostrogothic Italy over a period of the next couple decades. It's actually a pretty long fight with the Ostrogoths, but by 540, the capital of the Ostrogoths at Ravenna actually falls into Roman hands, and that's going to become, like I said, the center of their government in the peninsula while they maintain control of the peninsula. Later, Belisarius is going to be recalled to deal with Persian troubles on the eastern border, and the rest of the campaign is going to fall to Narses, who is another of the great generals of the day. By 554, the majority of Italy is again in the hands of the empire. Narses, who wraps up the final campaign, ends up going on. You have more conquest in the west, even attaining portions of Spain. Okay, now Spain was actually covered by the kingdom of the Visigoths, but a portion of that returns to Byzantine control at this point. They never completely reconquered the entire empire, but it looks a lot more like the old Rome than it did a generation earlier. As far as issues in Europe go, the one major enemy that kind of sweeps in around this time, a group known as the Avars, which are very similar to the Huns, and that they came kind of from the east, and rather than fighting them off, Justinian takes a policy of hiring them to actually defend the territories in that region against other barbarians. So King Bion I, the king of the Avars, actually accepts payment from Justinian in order to wipe out the remainder of the Huns and deal with a lot of the other tribes in that region. Ultimately, the Avars are going to move on further and further into the west. They're going to be stopped, however, by the Frankish kingdom under the Frankish king Sigebert I. We'll talk about the Franks in the next lecture, but essentially that's the status of the empire at the time of Justinian's death. Okay, so the empire looks a little bit like this. I'm going to show you a little bit more of a brighter version of this map right there. So you can see everything now in the yellow has been returned to Rome. This is going to be the peak of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire will never again be this large, okay? And it's going to lose that territory not long after Justinian's demise. But there are other important things to mention about Justinian's legacy before we move on to the status of the empire. Number one, like I said, he enlarged the Eastern Empire to its greatest extent, but he was also responsible for composing what's known as the Justinian Code. And this is a consolidation of the old, complex, somewhat contradictory legal tradition that goes all the way back to the Roman Republic. You can think of Rome, which was very, very instrumental in the development of political thought and law. The Roman Empire was around for a long time, even prior to Justinian. The Roman Republic was, well over 500 years earlier, and there have been plenty of laws. If you ever look at the way a government tends to operate, laws tend to accumulate. They very rarely disappear. So after that long a stretch of time, you can imagine how unwieldy the law code would have become. And what Justinian does is he tries to wean out, strip out kind of the useless laws to kind of streamline the legal system, dealing with constitutional matters, administrative matters, military, even ecclesiastical or church law is kind of all grouped up into this code that's come to be known as the Justinian Code. And this is going to become the foundation for law for the next 1,000 years within the Byzantine Empire, and it's going to have a huge impact on later legal systems within Europe. Even some of the systems today have their roots back in this particular legal code. Justinian's code actually was made up of about 4 different parts. You've got the code proper, or the Codex Justinianus, which was about 12 books of edicts that go all the way back to the time of Hadrian, and these were organized for the first time by topic. He also had the Digestum, which was a compendium of legal opinions, then the Institutiones, which was a handbook for people studying law, kind of a consolidation of the things that you see in the first 2 parts. And then at the end, he had the 4th part known as the Novellae Constitutiones, which were new edicts that were primarily issued by Justinian, and these were all written in Greek. The old Roman code, for the most part, is in Latin, as you would imagine, because that was still, up to this time, the official language of the empire. But Greek would have been the commonly spoken language in the East, which is one of the reasons Justinian's new edicts are in the Greek language, and you're going to see more and more of a shift towards Greek as we move forward. The next big contribution, I'd say, is in the area of architecture. The Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom, probably one of the most important buildings in the history of architecture. I know I mentioned that my favorite building from ancient Rome was the Pantheon in Rome, which is a huge domed temple that later becomes a Catholic church. The Hagia Sophia, also a domed building, and it's this design that's ultimately going to have a big impact on the design of Eastern Orthodox churches down the road and even Islamic mosques throughout the Near East. Now, this is not the first Church of Holy Wisdom that was built. There was an earlier church that was built at the time of Constantine. It had been destroyed in those Nika revolts that I mentioned back in 532. And this new building was made by Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, who were hired to build a new domed version of the church. And it was the greatest domed building of its day. As a matter of fact, it was an advance on the Pantheon design in that it was a dome not set upon a round base, but on a square building. And to do that, they had to develop new techniques in architecture. And the other thing that's kind of unique is instead of a single oculus letting in light from the top, as well as rain, you have windows that are placed around the circumference of the dome. So you have definitely an advance in architectural knowledge and the ability of the types of things that you can construct. The picture that you're seeing here, by the way, is the church as it looks today. Those minarets around the side, the 4 minarets actually are Islamic additions because the church later will become a mosque, then a museum, and currently the word is in the news that it's being redesigned and made into a mosque once again in Turkey. Anyways, some of the other things that go on during the reign of Justinian, the promotion of orthodoxy. Justinian takes a hard line to try to eliminate religious heresy for the most part, and non-Christian groups as well, right? He actually utilizes persecution, tolerance that had been present since the days of Constantine were essentially becoming less and less. Even under Theodosius I, you've got persecution of paganism and no more toleration for non-Christian sects, but now it's even going to include Christian sects. So some of the heretical sects that he was opposed to were things like the Arians, the Monophysites, Nestorians, and Copts. Monophysites particularly after the death of his wife, because remember, she was a Monophysite. But then he also issued edicts against some of the pagan things that were still around. Manichaeism, which technically wasn't pagan, but Manichaeism was attacked, as well as cults like the cult of Isis, which was still around in certain fashion, the worship of Amun in Egypt. Justinian even went so far as to close down philosophical schools, like in Athens, like I said, still a center of learning. But at this time, the Platonic Academy there, which was actually a Neo-Platonic academy, the original Academy of Plato was destroyed back in the 1st century BC by Sulla, but the new academy that had replaced it was finally shut down during the time of Justinian. Even when it comes to the Jews, who again are not pagan or heretical Christians, their own monotheism there was in some ways repressed by Justinian. At least we know that the Jews were forced to use the Septuagint in synagogue as opposed to the Hebrew scriptures. Remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation. And that was probably also fairly useful for them because, again, this is a Greek-speaking region, so I would assume that more and more of the Jews, that was their first language. Anyways, he fails to really get the church in the West, back in Rome, to look to him as a spiritual authority. Okay, so even though he's kind of taking leadership over the church in the East, the West is not going to recognize him as a spiritual head. And that's going to be an ongoing struggle between East and West that we'll look at down the road. The Eastern emperor is a civil authority, but he's also the religious leader. In the West, the popes in Rome tend to think of themselves as the spiritual authority who has oversight even over civil authorities and kings and emperors, okay, or at least a separate authority that is not subject to a civil administrator. So again, that's going to change from pope to pope and time to time. So again, a complicated issue that we can hold off on for now. Of course, at the end of his reign, with all these building programs and wars, you can imagine that he did leave quite a bit of debt. And that was also, the problem was also exacerbated by the fact that you have natural disasters and plagues occurring during his reign as well. So it might be the largest extent of the empire, but it's going to be in some financial problems or a fairly poor financial situation. Now, right after his death, things immediately start to reverse themselves. 568 to 572, you've got the invasion of the Lombards, a new group of barbarians into Italy, and very quickly, under their king Alboin, you have the loss of Italy. 2/3 of Italy is actually taken away from the empire, and Italy becomes politically fragmented. You've got Byzantine territories in certain regions, but the Lombards dominate the majority of the peninsula, and it's going to go on like that for a little while. 582 to 602 is the reign of the emperor known as Maurice. Now, he was Roman by background, and he was a really good military leader as far as the emperor. And that's something they actually needed. They were still at war with the Persians. He actually has a big role to play in ending, at least temporarily, the war with the Persians by helping the figure known as Khosroes II to attain the throne of Persia. He actually sent his troops to assist Khosroes to the throne, which results in an alliance between the Persians and the Romans. And this alliance was sealed with a marriage. Khosroes marries Maurice's daughter. In Europe, he has to deal with the Avars and also the new threat of the Slavs, which were on the Danube. And even though he was having some success pushing them back in Europe, he ends up having his victories cut short due to a mutiny among his troops. Basically, the army apparently saw him as overly strict, overly harsh, and they backed a guy by the name of Phocas for the imperial throne. Maurice ultimately abdicates the throne, gives it over to Phocas, but Phocas doesn't want him just off the throne. He'd rather have him eliminated altogether, and he arranges the murder not only of Maurice, but also of his 5 sons. Now, Phocas was not as good an emperor as Maurice by any account. He's referred to pretty much as a tyrant. He reigns for 8 years, from 602 to 610, and during his reign, you're going to have a lot of loss of empire. Okay, things that Maurice had gained, Phocas ultimately loses. Land in Europe retaken by the Avars and Slavs. As far as the situation with Persia goes, the peace that Maurice had established is ended. I mean, Khosroes, which is his own son-in-law by this point, is prompted by the assassination of Maurice to then go ahead and seize control of Roman forts in Mesopotamia. Ultimately, the Romans themselves in North Africa, which had kind of turned on him, are going to lead to his ousting, and this is under the direct leadership of a guy by the name of Heraclius. Phocas is going to be decapitated, and Heraclius is going to step in as the new emperor. Now, Heraclius is definitely the turning point where historians, at least, are going to start to talk about the emperor as a Byzantine or a Greek empire as opposed to a Roman empire. I don't know that's, like I said, that's not what the Romans themselves would do. They continue to refer to themselves as the Roman Empire, but the reasons for this are numerous. So let's take a look at the reign of Heraclius, because it's actually fairly significant. 610 to 642 is his reign. His father, Heraclius the Elder, was a general in North Africa, actually the exarch or governor of North Africa. And he's the one who kind of broke away from Phocas's control, sets up a separate state there, and then is going to campaign by sailing from North Africa with his son from Carthage to Constantinople to overthrow Phocas. He also is going to assume the war that Phocas leaves with Persia. Now, this is where Heraclius has his biggest struggle during his reign. The Persians it's going to be a back and forth war of attrition for the most part. By 614, the Persians had taken Jerusalem, and with it, there was a very important relic there. There's actually a lot of important relics in Jerusalem, which was one of the central religious sites within the Christian world. The relic known as the True Cross was taken back to Ctesiphon, which is the capital in Mesopotamia of the Persians. By 616, Persia had taken away Syria, Palestine, Egypt, several of the Mediterranean islands, and was actually camped directly across from Constantinople as a threat right there to the capital city itself. They had held now the city of Chalcedon in the region. Also on the other border, the Avars and Slavs continued to kind of dominate the Balkans, and Heraclius is basically between a rock and a hard place. In 618, he actually considers abandoning the capital city, with retreating with the government to Carthage and maybe holding out there. actually originally decided he was going to submit to Khosroes, to the Persians, become a vassal to the Persians. Actually, supposedly he wrote a letter to Khosroes saying that he was going to submit, and this apparently was rejected by Khosroes. And ultimately it was the patriarch, the head bishop there in Constantinople, that convinces Heraclius that he needs to stay, he needs to fight, and he's going to give church funds to the government in order to help rebuild the military. Now, temporarily, Heraclius makes a peace with Persia and, in fact, starts to pay kind of an annual tribute to the Persians while he can rebuild his military and actually make a stance against them. And in 622, he does this. He actually moves his troops into Persian territory, and this was set up sort of like a holy war. Now, the model that he's drawing on is probably the model of Constantine the Great, who, if you remember, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, supposedly put the sign of the Chi-Rho, one of the Christian symbols, on the shields of his soldiers before going into battle, and then attributes his victory to Christ. In this invasion of Persia, Heraclius does something similar. He carries before his troops an image of Christ as a standard. This particular image, which would have been a painting of the face of Christ, most likely may have been what's referred to as an acheiropoieton, which is the type of icon that is said to be made not by human hands, sort of this divine idea that it was the face of Christ miraculously preserved on some kind of surface. You hear references to icons like this in the Middle Ages, particularly the Sudarium, the Mendelian, maybe something like you might think when you later come upon something like the Shroud of Turin, right? The belief at the time was this is not something anybody painted, but it was a miraculous instance of the face of Christ. So it's kind of extra special. And probably carried with it a certain amount of power. So here he's carrying it before his troops. That whole idea of a holy war, by the way, against non-Christian opponents is going to eventually be picked up later on when we get to the Crusades. But he does have a few small victories that follow in 622. Unfortunately, the Persians push back in 626. Along with the Slavs and Avars, they besiege the city of Constantinople. Luckily, Heraclius' son is able to, command the navy to defend the city, and they ultimately keep the Avars on one side of the city and the Persians on the other side of the city from communicating and surviving this attempted siege. The siege is unsuccessful in the long run. After this, Heraclius strikes back again. So like I said, this is a back and forth battle. In 627, 628, Heraclius invades Mesopotamia, destroys the Persian army at the Battle of Nineveh. Khosroes himself is overthrown, and his successors attempt to make peace with the Roman army so that they don't march any further into Persian territory. Ultimately, Persian power at this point is broken. The eastern frontier is secured. Heraclius is able to even bring back the True Cross to Constantinople, and later he apparently brings it in procession to the city of Jerusalem in 629. Here's a painting of him doing that. So this is a very important moment. By the way, the other illustration on the right-hand side of the screen is a painting of Khosroes bowing before Heraclius, Persia ultimately submitting to the Romans. Now, the Romans don't conquer Persia. Persia's still there, but they've been weakened. The Byzantine Empire, the Romans, also were significantly weakened in this drawn-out battle with the Persians. And what happens in the last few years of Heraclius' reign is going to be really the game changer for the Roman Empire. With Persian power broken and Rome weakened, you have kind of a power gap. And into this gap, you're going to have a new arrival on the scene in history, which are going to be the Arabs. Okay, the Arabs ultimately sweep out of the Arabian Peninsula, which partially was controlled by Rome, but most of the Arabian Peninsula was, kind of beyond the control of Rome. It wasn't the most prosperous area. Nobody was really that interested in this desert peninsula for the most part. But at this time, you've got the beginning of what's going to be an Arab empire, and it's also going to be the advent of Islam moving into the region. Islam is a new religion, actually very new religion. As a matter of fact, the Prophet Muhammad, who is the founder of Islam, dies in 632. right there during the reign of Heraclius. He was a contemporary of Heraclius. Muhammad, if you're not familiar with Islam, was the final prophet. He was the seal of the prophets. He was Allah's messenger. And again, the religion is going to be a monotheistic religion. Islam means submission, and it's to the God that I just mentioned, Allah. Now, the tradition in Islam is that Muhammad actually wrote a letter to Heraclius asking him to convert to Islam. This letter is preserved, or this particular episode is preserved in the Islamic Hadith, in Bukhari's Hadith number 6. You actually have the story of how this happened, and according to the story, Heraclius actually considers embracing Islam, abandoning Christianity, and then presents the option to his nobles, who ultimately reject it. And that's the reason that Christianity, or at least the empire, didn't convert to Islam. Islam typically views Heraclius historically as kind of a devout man, a just ruler for the most part. But in his rejection of Islam, it's going to justify, the continuing expansion of Islam into Roman territory. So that has been one of the reasons people have assumed that this letter was put into the tradition. Whether it actually occurred historically is a matter for some actual debate, though I think most scholars don't believe this is an actual letter. The tradition developed later. Anyways, from 636 to 642, the last few years of Heraclius' reign, you have Umar, one of the Rashidun caliphs who ruled directly after the death of Muhammad, begins the conquest of the Middle East. Umar himself is going to reign in Islam from 634 to 644. But during his time and during Heraclius' reign, he witnesses a number of devastating defeats. In 636, the Battle of Yarmouk sees the Arab army for the first time defeat a Roman army on the field. 637, the Persians lose Ctesiphon. Ultimately, Persia is going to fall completely to the Arabs. But in the same year, Jerusalem falls for the Christians. Okay, the true cross at this point disappears, apparently forever. We don't hear of any more references to that historically. But by the time of his death in 642, the empire had lost to the Arabs Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Libya. The Arab armies were even on the verge of taking Asia Minor, or Anatolia itself, right there at the heartland of the empire. And some have actually speculated that the heretical groups within the Roman Empire were very happy with the Arab conquest, right? The Monophysites in North Africa, for instance, if they were persecuted, would have been willing to, come under the auspices of a different leadership. Now, of course, the cities in North Africa did hold out quite a bit against the Arab invasion, but that's one of the ways that people describe this kind of transition. Okay, now with the loss of this territory, remember, the three major patriarchal seats outside of Constantinople and Rome, which would have been Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, are now in Arab hands, or in Islamic hands. There's going to continue to be a patriarch in those cities, even up to the modern day, but those cities have now been detached, at least for a while, from the Roman Empire. Okay, so let's talk about it as a Greek empire. Since I've been referring to it as a Roman empire, why do people call the reign of Heraclius kind of this turning point? Well, there are a number of changes during the reign of Heraclius. For instance, the common language in the East had been Greek. Okay, there were not very many Latin speakers anymore, even though Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. At this point, you're going to have a shift to Greek. It's going to replace Latin as the official language. The title Augustus, which is still used, is going to be more and more replaced by the title Basileus, which means king. Okay, and that again goes with, the switch in language. The government itself is restructured. Part of the restructuring has to do with the institution of what are known as themata. Now, there's a question here because some people say that the theme system is actually developed by Constans II a little bit later, but it's most likely the case that the foundation for this development starts with Heraclius. And what the themata were these territories. You can actually see on the map here kind of a breakdown of the themes in Anatolia. What this was kind of a shifting in the way the government was set up. If you go back to the time of Diocletian, the the late Empire, he sets up a system of dioceses, which were governed by a civil administrator and a military administrator, kind of a separation of civil and military authority within the empire. What happens with the theme system is you have a unification once again of the civil and military structure. Okay, and you also start to have a return to the farmer-soldier idea, where you're giving the soldiers in the empire plots of land to farm and settle down on. If you go back in the day, the Romans would often give plots of land to soldiers upon retirement. This here is a different way to kind of pay your military. You give them a piece of land, they farm the land, ultimately they return military service for that territory. This is more along the lines of something you might see in Europe, what we refer to as kind of the feudal system. Okay, so that becomes the situation here in the Byzantine Empire. Also, you're going to have a very close relationship develop with the patriarch. Okay, again, there's always that connection between church and state, but now it's going to become even closer than before. So historians tend to consider this now the beginning of a more Greek empire than a Roman empire. This is why they start to talk about it from this point going forward really as the Byzantine Empire, which I'm going to try to do off and on. I know I'm going to still refer to them as Romans. Now, Heraclius himself was somebody that tried to settle down some of the religious disagreement of the time. Again, conflict between the Orthodox and the Monophysites. He actually tries to come up with kind of a middle point that is hopefully going to please everybody. It was a view known as monothelitism, which is the idea that Orthodoxy believes in Christ having two natures. Monophysites believe Christ only had one nature. Monothelitism is a middle point. I guess not really a middle point, but it was the view that Christ had a single will, if not a single nature. Now, this is absolutely an abysmal disaster as far as a compromise goes, because both the Orthodox and Monophysites view this new position as heretical. So whatever attempts he's making to kind of bring these groups together ultimately fails, as you would expect. Theology happens to be one of these areas where you're going to have very strong feelings, and ultimately you're going to have more and more of a division, not only in the empire, but also between East and West over kind of this some theological issues. Anyways, now let's talk about Islam. Let's talk about the issue of iconoclasm. These are actually intertwined in a certain way. But in 677, the Arabs have now pressed further forward. They've already taken a good portion of the empire. Now they're situated right outside the capital city, besieging Constantinople. The Umayyad Caliphate, which is the leadership of the Arab Empire at the time, had set up bases around the Mediterranean, very close to Constantinople, between 674 and 677. Constantine IV is able to actually hold the Arabs off and defeat the forces of the Arab leader Muawiyah. He was the caliph at the time, ultimately destroying the Arab navy with a brand new invention that was introduced known as Greek fire. If you don't know anything about Greek fire, the illustration on the screen is an old illustration of what this was like. It was kind of like a flame. Well, itself wasn't a flamethrower, but it could be used in what are kind of early flamethrower type devices, even earlier grenades. It was a concoction that was basically a chemical concoction of a couple of different elements, saltpeter and some other things, naphtha oil, that made something like a napalm for the most part. It was something that could stick to you. It could burn even in water. So it was devastating, obviously, to ships at sea. You can't put it out very easily. So this becomes, for the Byzantines, for the Romans, kind of their nuclear bomb of the day. And it's going to give them an advantage. At least it's going to help preserve their dominance, in at least at sea and around the city for quite a while. Now, not long after the Arabs are defeated, you do have more issues in Europe. 681, the Bulgars and the Slavs have pressed into the southern portion of the Danube and have set up a kingdom right there in the Balkans in Eastern Europe. They actually end up defeating the Emperor Constantine IV. There's a peace treaty that's ultimately signed, but the Bulgars and Slavs are going to be a continuing enemy for the empire going forward. Sometimes they'll be allies, but for the most part, they're going to be a threat to the Romans. On the throne in 717 is an important figure, Leo III. He's going to reign from 717 to 741. Now, during his reign, he's known as Leo the Isaurian. You're going to have a big conflict with Islam once again, with the Arabs. Now, he was a good man for the time because he not only spoke Greek, he actually spoke Arabic, which is going to make him fairly educated in and able to communicate with the people who he's going to be faced with. And in that very year of his ascension to the throne, 717, you have another siege of Constantinople. This is the second Arab siege of Constantinople, which again the Romans are able to repel. The Umayyad Caliphate takes a huge loss. The Romans are actually aided by the Bulgars in this particular war, but the Arabs lose approximately 150,000 soldiers, apparently, to not only Greek fire, but also weather. And this victory is going to be viewed as one of those moments in history which changes the picture of sorts. It actually is the temporary stop to Arab expansion into Europe. Okay, now that's going to be picked up again later, but for the most part, this victory in 718 is going to mark the extent of the Arab Empire into Europe, at least from the east. Okay, there's going to be issues that we'll talk about later with the Arabs entering Europe from the west, but for now, Europe is isolated, protected, and some say Christianity is preserved because of this victory. It might be a little bit of an overstatement, but he is viewed as one of the great saviors of the Byzantine Empire and of Christianity in general. Now, what happens later in his reign is a movement known as iconoclasm. I mentioned icons being incredibly important in religion. All right, these are works of art. Sometimes they're also relics that were venerated in a way, and some people believed had special spiritual power, even healing power. There were lots of these things circulating in the church at the time. Now, where this comes to the attention of Leo is he begins to oppose the use of icons. That's what iconoclasm means. It means the destruction of icons. The church typically was iconodual, meaning they were people that venerated icons. Now, one of the reasons Leo kind of turns on the use of icons may have been for theological reasons, maybe for financial reasons. It's hard to say, but I'll give you some of the reasoning that's possibly there. He tends to ban images because he does witness, for instance, the Islamic advance. Right? The Islamic Empire had been incredibly successful. The Roman Empire had been dwindling. One thing that people that know Islam understand is that Islam was very strictly opposed to the use of images. Right? Representational art in Islam is kind of a minority school. The Old Testament, however, also has prescriptions against the use of images. If you go to the book of Exodus in chapter 20, where it talks about not making any graven image. Okay, this commandment apparently was being ignored by Christianity, which had tons of graven images and paintings. So Leo saw this as not only against the Bible, but he also saw it as something that clearly God was benefiting or favoring the Muslims and punishing the Christians because of this kind of sin. So that's kind of how he understood the situation. There was also, at the time of Leo, an eruption on the island of Thera. And again, if you remember Thera, this was the island that erupted back in 1600, 1500 BC that was connected to the Minoan chronology. When we talked about ancient Minoan culture, we talked about the eruption of Thera. Well, it erupts, and again, it's still an active volcano today, but it erupted during the reign of Leo. And even though this is no longer a pagan empire, you still have kind of a holdover of the idea that when things like that happen, natural disasters, this is all connected somehow to God. And the idea of an eruption on the island would have been some kind of sign that God was displeased in some way. So this is kind of how he interpreted it. On the other hand, some people say, well, Leo really just saw the practicality of seizing the icons and the wealth that was attached to them, which were kind of in the hands of the churches and the monasteries in the East. So whether it was politically motivated or financially motivated or theologically motivated, all we know is this whole movement of iconoclasm begins, and you have a great deal of destruction of these things. Now, this is going to be a back and forth debate within Eastern Christianity. And temporarily, it's going to be dealt with by an empress later in the 8th century by the name of Irene the Athenian, who was empress from 775 to 802. She actually calls a church council on the issue, and it's called the Second Council of Nicaea, to deal with the issue of iconoclasm. She was opposed to iconoclasm, so the church basically backed her up in the end. But you're still going to have kind of a back and forth. Now, she was an incredibly powerful ruler in her own right. She wasn't just empress, as in she was married to the emperor. She was actually married to Emperor Leo IV, but after his death, she becomes regent for her son, Constantine VI, and being kind of ambitious to the extent, she was ambitious to the extent where she even had her own son later blinded and killed so that she could become the sole ruler of the empire in her own right. Now, there's going to be some opposition in the West to this. Number one, the idea that here you have a woman on the throne of Rome who has control over the church in the East, even calls a council. Now, even though the Western church agreed with her on the issue of iconoclasm, they were in many ways opposed to her being in a position of authority over the church. And as a response to this, the Pope, also by the name of Pope Leo III, in the year 800 on Christmas Day, crowns an emperor in Europe as opposed to the emperor in the East. That's going to be the Frankish king Charles the Great, who we'll talk about when we get to the Franks later on. But this very event is one of the things that starts to, even more so, pull apart Eastern and Western Christianity. It's a long separation over many, many issues, but this is one of those. And it's going to be really, I think, the pivotal issue is this issue of authority and leadership within the church and within the state. Now, the Golden Age, not a lot to really talk about in the Golden Age. It was a time of great prosperity within the Byzantine Empire. From 867 to 1081 is usually designated the Golden Age. This was during the time of the Macedonian dynasty. It was founded by Basil I, 867 to 886, or the years of his reign. And it's a period of expansion primarily in Europe, not so much in the Near East, but there was some expansion even against the Arab empires. And it was also a time of missionary activity. You've got missionaries being sent out to the barbarian tribes on the European side, and you have the Christianization of groups like the Bulgars, the Serbs, the Slavs, even the Russians embraced Christianity during this time. As far as conquests go, particularly in the Arab Near Eastern territories, there's a pushback against the now Abbasid Caliphate, which is ruling from Baghdad and Mesopotamia. But a number of the emperors, like Nicephorus II, captures Aleppo, Crete, Cyprus, Antioch. These cities are taken back. Under John I Zimiscus, you have Damascus, Beirut, Acre, Sidon, Caesarea Tiberias retaken. It's a good portion of the coastal region taken back. They don't get Jerusalem, however, which is going to be something that later the Western Christians are going to be very interested in. By the time we get to 976, you have the reign of Basil II, 976 to 1025. He's known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, which tells you that his military campaigns were primarily directed into Europe against the Bulgars. Again, brought a great deal of success and stability to the empire. The next big threat is going to emerge at the time, really in Italy and Sicily, and this was the advent of the Normans. The Normans were ultimately Germanic Viking groups that had come down and settled in the coast of France, which is later known as Normandy. This is in the 11th century. They become a really big player in the region. The most famous Norman leader in the 11th century is actually William the Conqueror, who took over Britain, if you're familiar, in 1066, the Battle of Hastings. There are other Norman leaders, particularly in Italy, that are going to become really aggressive towards the Byzantine Empire and ultimately, like I said, take over Italy and Sicily from Byzantine control. And some of these guys are later going to make assaults on Constantinople itself, which I'll get to in a little bit. But the biggest event during the Golden Age and the most long-lasting consequences is what's known as the Great Schism that happens in 1054, or the Eastern Schism, which is a division between the Eastern and Western churches. The Western Church is going to become the Roman Catholic Church, or the Catholic tradition, and the Eastern Church is going to be known as the Eastern Orthodox churches. I'm going to deal with the differences between those churches in a future lecture, but this is a major, major moment. And at the time, it seemed like a very insignificant event that took place. It really has to do with a couple headstrong bishops, excommunicating each other, but the division was never completely healed, even though attempts were made over the centuries to bring together those two churches. It's never going to quite work out, and I'll talk about some of the attempts in a little bit. The last event that really is the thing that brings an end to this golden age is a battle that takes place in 1071, known as the Battle of Manzikert. The new enemy that the empire was facing was from the east. It was not the Arab Muslims, but the Turkish Muslims. The Turks were a group that had moved in from Central Asia, had recently converted to Islam, and at the Battle of Manzikert, the Roman Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes faces off against the Turkish leader Alp Arslan. And it was a major, major defeat for Rome. The Turks ended up taking over a good portion of Anatolia and pushed further forward, even to the point where by 1081 they held the city of Nicaea, which is directly across from Constantinople. Almost the entire empire in Asia has now been lost to Rome, by 1081. And this battle was pivotal. 1081 is going to be the beginning of a new dynasty which takes the throne. And this is also going to be the era of the Crusades. In 1081, Alexius Comnenus comes to the throne. He's going to rule until 1118. This is the Comnenian dynasty. It's going to last until 1185. And under Alexius and his successors, the empire becomes fully militarized and even feudalized, where the people are, again, more and more tied to the land. The free peasantry tends to disappear. Part of this remilitarization is to deal with not only threats like the Turks, but also threats like the Normans, right? Those people that I mentioned a second ago. In this era, you've got Robert Guiscard, Bohemond of Taranto, some of these leaders, Norman leaders in Italy and Sicily, becoming a plague on Rome. Alexius ultimately makes some deals with the city of Venice, giving Venice ultimately control over Mediterranean sea trade. You have, in this time, also more and more Latin-speaking people, traders, merchants, and stuff from the West moving into Constantinople, so that the city itself, as large as it was, had a huge portion of its population that was made up of foreign Latin-speaking peoples. About 60,000 Latins were in the city of Constantinople. Now, this is going to become an issue, as we'll get to in a little bit. But the immediate problem is the Turks, or was the Turks. In 1092, the Turkish leader Malik Shah dies, leaving his territory in a bit of chaos among his sons. Ultimately, Asia Minor is broken up among his sons, and the Turks are now vulnerable for the Romans to try to retake some of their territory. And what Alexius does is he writes to the Pope, Urban II, in the West to get some aid. He wants some soldiers sent to assist him in the reconquest of his territories, particularly some knights, some trained warriors. He even sends envoys in 1095 to the Council of Piacenza to meet with the Pope. But the Pope does respond in the year 1095 at another council known as the Council of Clermont, but he responds in a way that I don't think Alexius was expecting. The Pope calls for a crusade. Now, he doesn't use the term crusade, but he calls for people to take up arms and to go to the east in order to liberate not the territories held by Arabs that belong to Rome, but to liberate the Holy Land from Islam. It was a call that, in a way, unified Europe, but also began a very religious fervor that swept through Europe. And there's going to be another couple centuries of crusading fervor that begins with this speech at Clermont. In 1097, Constantinople witnesses the results of the requests of Alexius. At the gates of the city, you have the arrival of thousands, at first, of peasants. This was known as the People's Crusade, kind of instigated by Peter the Hermit and a number of other preachers that had just popularly gathered people together in various territories and marched on their own, without any real political leadership, to the Near East. And Alexius sees this group emerge outside the city walls of Constantinople, wanting to be let in and fed and all kinds of stuff, and he's not going to let them in, so he immediately shuttles them across the Bosporus to Asia, where they're promptly wiped out by the Turks, as you would expect. A lot of them probably sold into slavery. It was not long after this that the actual First Crusade arrives at Constantinople, and these were thousands of heavily armored Norman and French knights that then are forced to swear loyalty to Alexius and agree that whatever they take in Asia will be returned to the empire. And the empire itself is going to assist with the beginning stages of this crusade. Ultimately, their alliance falls apart. The territories in Asia are essentially returned to Rome during the campaign as it moved down to Jerusalem. But by the time the Crusaders get to Antioch, their relationship with the Byzantine Empire had fragmented, and the Crusaders are ultimately going to continue to conquer, but they're going to hold on to those territories in the Holy Land for themselves. It's the beginning of what is known as the Crusader States, which is going to last for a couple hundred years there in the Near East. As far as Roman territorial acquisitions, a lot of what they had accomplished by taking back Asia Minor was lost by 1176 at the Battle of Myricephalum. The Romans essentially lose again most of that territory. Now, also in the late 12th century, I should also point out the idea of kind of reestablishing contact between Eastern and Western churches was really on the table very strongly during this time. With the Crusades, over and over again, you're going to have this idea of the church in the East and West working together, and the hope being extended that the church would come together. This was continually, failing every time they attempted it, but it was something that was attempted. One of the big things that ultimately is going to prevent any real successful reunion are going to be a couple of events that take place in the late 12th, early 13th century. One of them was a massacre of the Latin population in the city of Constantinople in 1182. There was, like I said, a huge population of Latin speakers from the West that were residing in the city, that were doing business and were very prosperous within the city, and had even the favoritism of emperors. I mean, our Empress Maria of Antioch, who was the wife of Emperor Manuel, was a Frankish queen, essentially, and she showed a lot of favoritism towards the Latin merchants and landowners within Constantinople. When Alexius II, her son, was deposed, the guy that steps in, Andronicus I, allows the angry mobs of, native Greek speakers to rise up against the foreign Latin speakers and slaughtered, thousands of them in this massacre that was going to go on to remain in the memory of the West for quite a while afterward. Now, in 1204, the big thing that is going to disrupt any kind of reconciliation between East and West was the Fourth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade was not a crusade originally designed to take Constantinople, but this is what it's going to result in at the end. It was an attempt originally, or the goal was to retake Jerusalem. And the Crusaders had arrived at Venice, Italy, and their idea was to get passage via Venetian ships to North Africa and Egypt, and then they were going to move from Egypt upward into the Holy Land to retake Jerusalem. Now, the Crusade leaders at least, had negotiated with the Doge of Venice for him to provide ships and supplies for this expedition. This was a massive undertaking. And Venice actually stopped a lot of their other business to fulfill the contract for the Crusaders. But when it came time to set sail, there weren't very many Crusaders that actually showed up for crusade. So they had way more ships and supplies accumulated than they had the ability to pay for. Now, Venice wanted their money. I mean, their whole economy was kind of centered around this contract at the time. So the Venetians end up getting the Crusaders themselves to pay off this debt by using the Crusaders to attack one of their rivals in Europe, a city by the name of Zara in Hungary. It was a trade rival of theirs. The Crusaders end up attacking Zara, contrary to the wishes of the Pope, because, again, Zara is a Christian city at this time. But the Crusaders attack Zara, and at the time come to the attention of a guy by the name of Alexius Angelos, who was the son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II in Constantinople. Now, Alexius negotiates with the Crusaders to get them to help put his father back on the throne. He says, if you put my father back on the throne, march on the city of Constantinople, I'm going to pay you like 200,000 silver marks, whatever the debt is for Venice. He's going to basically pay off the Crusader debt. He's actually even going to join the Crusaders on crusade and supply them with everything they need to get them to Egypt. So the Crusaders take him up on the offer, and they come to Constantinople, put Isaac on the throne. And even though he's only there temporarily, he's not able. They don't have the finances to actually fulfill the payment to their agreement with the Crusaders. And what it results in, especially after Isaac is actually kicked off the throne again, is a Crusader riot. The Crusaders end up sacking the city of Constantinople and effectively taking over the city of Constantinople for the next approximately 60 years. It's going to be in the hands of the Latins in the West. Now, we're eventually getting towards now the fall of Rome, part 2, the Eastern Fall. So let's take a look at what happened after the Latin conquest in this Fourth Crusade. There were a number of successor states. There are at least 3 successor states that remained in the East. The Empire of Nicaea was one of them. This was a state that was still in the hands of the Byzantines. It held off against the Seljuk Turks for a while. As a matter of fact, the Turkish threat comes to an end for the most part, temporarily, because of a new invasion by the Mongols. In 1242, the Mongols actually destroy the Seljuk Turks right there in the Near East, and this allows the success of Nicaea, the survival of Nicaea, and allows the Empire of Nicaea to turn its attention towards reconquering Constantinople, which takes place in 1261. Michael VIII Palaeologus recovers the city, is going to found the very last dynasty of the Byzantine Empire, and attempts to actually reconcile with Rome, which is interesting given the fact that the Western Church, or the Western warriors at least, had just taken the city, 60 years earlier approximately. But most people believe that the reason he attempts to force submission to Rome religiously was because he wanted to prevent any kind of Latin attempts to retake the city again, if he could kind of settle down at least one issue. Again, it doesn't work because the people, the church in the East, refuse to be reunited and submit to the Pope in Rome. Anyways, what you're going to see now is at the end of this century, the rise of a second Turkish empire. This is going to be known as the Ottoman Empire, which effectively emerges around 1300. Now, the Ottomans are going to be the last real enemy of the empire, and it's going to continue to see the weakening of Rome over the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, during the 14th century, the empire is racked with civil war. You've got dealings with Serbian Empire on their western border. You've got the Ottomans on the east starting to encroach further and further on Constantinople. And then you've got the Black Death on top of this, which is not going to help because it wipes out about half the population of Constantinople between 1346 and 1349. Okay, so it's going to be very hard to mount a successful defense against your enemies when your population is devastated. By 1354, the Ottoman Turks have come across into Europe. They seize the city of Gallipoli on the European side of the Hellespont, which was where the Byzantines had a very strong defense that had been wrecked by earthquake, which left them vulnerable to this Turkish invasion. And now the Turks are on both sides of Constantinople. And Constantinople is going to be increasingly isolated, particularly more so in 1361, where the Sultan Murad I captures the Christian city of Adrianople and actually makes it their capital, the Turkish capital. So Constantinople at this point is isolated from Europe. There's really nothing left of it in Asia, and it's really nothing more than the city of Constantinople itself. So it's really hard to even refer to as an empire. They still held some territory in Greece itself, but essentially it's one city on its own, completely surrounded. Yet it continues to hold out. It had some sporadic assistance from Europe, Roman troops in the West. And even again, you have this idea that we can reunify, right? The papacy and the emperor in the East often make deals to try to bring the church together. As a matter of fact, in 1439, not long before the ultimate fall of the empire, John VIII Palaeologus negotiates submission to the Pope Eugene IV. Actually issues a bull of union, which was again rejected by the Eastern Church. So ultimately, they're going to be on their own when it comes to the final days of the empire, and that takes place in 1453. The Byzantine Empire is going to fall on May 29th, and it's after a 2-month siege of the city under the Turkish leader Mehmet II, known as Mehmet the Conqueror. He was one of the great Turkish commanders, as his nickname indicates, right? Mehmet the Conqueror for a reason. 2-month siege, you've got 80,000 Turks facing off against only about 7,000 defenders. This is the city that was the largest city in Europe. At its peak, like I said, 800,000 plus people, and now you only have 7,000 defenders left to hold off against a massive, massive army. And you also have a change in warfare. It's not just men with swords and bows and arrows and cavalry coming up against the city walls. You now have heavy artillery. At this point, you've got cannons involved. All right, the Turkish army had over 70 cannons, aimed at the city walls. A couple of them were these massive bombards that apparently were able to, hurl stones up to 600 pounds over a mile away. They weren't very accurate, but you can imagine if your walls were hit by something thrown from one of these massive cannons, the devastation that it would have. The city wall was eventually breached. Constantine XI, who was the last emperor, on the day that the city fell, took Mass communion at the Church of Hagia Sophia and then went out to fight in the breach with his troops and died right there at the wall. Now this brings an end to the empire. It's the end of the city of Constantinople. It's a turning point in in world history, really. You can even think of it as a moment when the Middle Ages effectively comes to a conclusion. Some people mark that moment, that the fall of this great city, as the end of the Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, it was also the end of this bulwark against Islam as far as Europe was concerned from the east, because the Ottoman Empire afterward would continue to press further and further into Europe, eventually arriving at the gates of Vienna. But the Byzantine Empire was over. 1,000 years, they have a presence, and a very important presence. Some of the influence of the Byzantine Empire would continue on, in that a lot of the people from the now destroyed empire and the destroyed city fled into the West. And what they brought with them was more of the learning that had been preserved among the Byzantines. Right? We think of the stages, the conditions in Europe of the time as somewhat behind the level of learning and knowledge that was preserved in the Roman Empire and in the Islamic empires. A little bit of an overstatement, but you do have a lot more of this stuff being brought into Europe. The Crusades, incidentally, as well, brought a lot of this knowledge of the East back to Europe, and eventually you're going to have the beginning of what's known as the Renaissance break forth. As a matter of fact, we're right there at the birth point of the Renaissance as the Middle Ages concludes. So after several thousand years now, really, of Roman control, Roman Empire on the world stage, eventually it comes to a close. But as you would imagine, after a period of such a long time with a single empire really being there, the impact that it has on future history is not going to disappear overnight. As we said, the Code of Justinian lingers on, has an impact on governmental structure today, but Rome in general has a huge impact on world history and culture today. So we're done with the eastern portion of the Middle Ages. Next lecture, we're actually going to turn our attention towards the West. We're going to take a look at the kingdom of the Franks and what's going on in Europe while this stuff is going on in the East.